Well, thank you all very much for coming. It's a great pleasure to have such a good audience. I'll just begin by acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet this evening, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Thank them for the care of their land and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. This is part of a series, Ideas in Society, and if you would like to find out more, you can follow us on the La Trobe website. I've had a great pleasure this year in talking to a number of Australians who I admire deeply, and we've had Clive Hamilton on climate change, and Waleed Ali on Islam and politics, Helen Garner and Ramona Cavall, and my wife Anne Manne on writing in dark territory, General Morrison on institutions and violence, Julian Assange at the Bendigo Festival on Julian Assange, really. And tonight, something I've been thinking of doing for a very long time, and I'm really pleased she agreed to the invitation. In the age of Google, I don't particularly believe we need introductions, and you wouldn't be here unless you knew Michelle Grattan's work. She's written for The Age and Fairfax for a very long time, was the first female editor of a newspaper, I think, the Canberra Times, and is now both, many of you will hear her 3 times a week on Radio National with Fran Kelly, but also many of you will also be reading her astonishing output every day on The Conversation, one of the great innovations in journalism and relation between journalism and academia. That very pleased Andrew Jaspin's here, who had such a good idea. Why I'm so pleased is that Michelle, in a way, has been, if I can say, doing the same thing for a very long time and doing it superlatively well. Every morning when I listen, or every morning when I go to my computer and read her, what I value is partly the depth of her knowledge of Australian politics over the long term, and partly a sort of capacity for fair-minded but incisive judgment. So I'd like, I pay my respects to what you've done, and it's part of the reason I was so pleased that you agreed. What Michelle does every day is to talk about what's happened in the past 24 hours, but often one knows that she is basing those judgments on having followed things for so long with such attention. And I thought tonight what we might do is talk not about what's happened last week or today, but to talk about what's happened over the past 40 years or so, and to think about the shape both of Australian governments and some of the most intractable or interesting policy areas and developments in the nation. So, Michelle, can I start by beginning at where our starting point, which is the Whitlam era, and I suppose the comment I'd make is that even though it was only 3 years, in fact 2 governments, some people would say that what was achieved in transforming the nation, and for the better, in those 3 years was more substantial than has been done by any of the 9 or so governments since. So I just wonder if you like to comment on in a way, the role of the Whitlam government in the nation.
Well, thank you first for your invitation to be here, Robert, and it's a pleasure to talk and discuss these issues tonight, and thank you to everyone who's come along. To address what you've put, I think that obviously the Whitlam government was transformational, and if we think of all the governments that came after, it was one of the most transformational. But if I was assessing the whole period, I would put also the Hawke government as the other really landmark government in the period. And I think it's interesting that both governments transformed things in part because they were products of their times. The Whitlam government was, in a way, although it started in the 70s, of course, and ran for a very brief period in the early 70s, but in a way it was a product of the 60s, of the atmosphere of change and the new issues that were coming up in that time, the needs of Australian suburbia in particular, you know, the cities and sewerage, that Gough Whitlam was sometimes ridiculed for, but was associated with those very basic issues. And the mood of optimism, and people were open to change, and therefore he picked up on the issues that concerned people, and he picked up on the mood of optimism and was able to carry forward policies partly because of that mood. The Hawke government was in a different situation, but also what it did was a product of events as well, because the pressures at that time in the 80s were to change the Australian economy. The world was going to make any government really do that.
Yes.
And it was a massive task. And it's interesting that it was a task that involved Hawke breaking some significant promises that he'd come to power with. And yet people accepted that because they didn't just see it as some cavalier going back on your word, they saw it as necessary for what had to be done. Now, Hawke was flexible and did break promises. Whitlam was inflexible and insisted on keeping every promise. And that was part of a reason, contributing factor for his downfall. And Hawke's success really was being able to explain to people, well, things look different a couple of years ago, but now we've got to take this course.
Does it follow from that that you think one of the great strengths of Hawke was as a communicator with the nation in a way that perhaps Whitlam wasn't able to explain what he was doing in the same way?
Look, I think Whitlam was a good communicator in that he sold a quite visionary program. But I think Whitlam was, as I say, more inflexible. I don't think he was as good a leader of a team, and the team he had was quite a difficult one. And of course the Hawke government learnt from that, from the faults of Whitlam. Yes. and made it clear that it wasn't going to be another Whitlam government. Whitlam, by that stage, hadn't sort of come back into fashion, yes, as it were. But I think that Hawke was he was a very good communicator, but he was also someone who understood what needed to be done. Now, you might remember that before he came in, because he hadn't been in Parliament long, and he, of course, was only leader going into the election campaign, made leader. But people would say, oh, he's a lightweight, and, you know, and those supporting him would say, well, he'll just be sort of chairman of the board and other people will run things and don't worry about him, it'll all be okay. But in fact, Hawke, of course, had a very detailed knowledge of policy, yes, and an ability to know in a changing situation what had to be done. In Whitlam's case, the changes just were the international changes, which meant that it would have been very hard for any government to cope, but he lacked the flexibility to be able to cope.
I mean, just a couple of things about Whitlam. One is that he's a very polarising figure in a way that Hawke wasn't. Would you agree with that?
I don't think he was polarising in the beginning. I think he became polarising later. I think that when he was coming to power, 69 election, that whole period, he was polarising within the ALP to an extent.
Yes.
But for the general community, I think people identified with the issues that he was taking up, because health, education, cities affected their lives. But I think when the government started to make mistakes and the coalition played the game really, really hard, then he did become polarising.
Yeah, and the other thing I often wondered about this, Australian politics is often commented on without a sense of the rest of the world, but Whitlam had the misfortune of being in government at the time, you know, the great stagflation crisis hit everywhere, and I just wondered whether you agree with the thought that, but he wasn't equipped for that probably because he wasn't interested in economics much, but also that what was happening here wasn't related by the public or even the media at the time to the general kind of crisis of the world economy or the developed world economy. And he was greatly unfortunate because the last 18 months, the shadow of stagflation and so on fell across the government.
Yes, well, as I said, I think he was overtaken by those events. I'm not sure the public would have been that sympathetic even if they'd had related it better, frankly, because governments tend to be blamed even when they're not exactly to blame. So there were two lots of factors. One lot that he couldn't be blamed for, but of course others, another set of factors that he was to be blamed.
The loans affair. And so.
Well, I guess it's a failure to follow the proper processes of government, and that reflected itself in the loans affair, but also in the day-to-day administration of the government. Remember that all the ministers were in cabinet, that these people had waited for a very long time to get to power. They all had ideas and they wanted to run their own race. People like Clyde Cameron, for example, Jim Cairns, they were strong and often willful figures, and Gough Whitlam was not the sort of leader that could bind these people together, you know, because he was a willful and often impatient figure himself.
Yes,
now, Hawke was, I think, well, he came to power, of course, on the whole consensus idea for the community, but he was also a figure that was able to manage people, some of them difficult, like Keating could be, and of course they had some big fights, but I think he understood how to run a team better than Whitlam.
Yeah. I think people of a conservative bent in Australia would think that the best government we've had since Whitlam, or actually they wouldn't say since Whitlam, the best government we've had in post-war period, probably after Menzies, was the Howard government. I think people of the centre-left probably think the Hawke government was the most successful. Just wondered, if we could talk about Howard for a while. What do you now think about how we should, as historians, see the Howard period in our life?
Well, I would say the Hawke government was the most successful of the governments we're talking about in these periods, even though we were talking about the transformational effect of Whitlam. But if we're talking about a government that was successful, I think the Howard government was a competent government. In terms of reform, though, what did it do? Well, the big thing was the tax reform, but you didn't have a broad, extensive suite of reforms that endured, because the industrial relations reform, of course, went over the top and ended up being rolled back, and that's hardly successful reform. I do think that people these days tend to romanticise the Howard government. Some of the commentators sort of refer everything back to Howard, and it's as though somehow it was all smooth sailing. Well, my memory mightn't be very good, but it didn't seem like that always at the time, I have to say. I think that there were a lot of ups and downs and bumps and tensions and so on. But nevertheless, in terms of running a government, Howard, I think, was an effective Prime Minister. He did run a cabinet well. If you contrast him, for example, with Malcolm Fraser, who wanted to be personally and have his department involved in everything and second-guess things, and ran a cabinet in a rather shambling way. I remember to this day a piece by Anne Summers describing the ministers bouncing off the walls when they were summoned to cabinet several times during the day,
yes.
Starting early and going late. So I think that Howard, as a Prime Minister, was quite effective, quite successful, knew how to do the job.
One of the things that, this shows my sort of own bias, but one of the things that I don't understand is the reputation of George Bush in the United States, certainly the reputation of Tony Blair, United Kingdom, very badly affected by the mistake they made in invading Iraq and the catastrophe that's followed. It doesn't seem in the commentary I read ever to have much affected the way in which both the supporters of the Howard government but also general opinion regards that government. And I just wondered if you agree with that, but also whether you have any thoughts as to why that might be.
I think I would agree with that. I noticed, though, when that recent British report came out, that Howard, in a few interviews, was sort of quite defensive of that decision on his part. And I think he knows it's a sort of historically sensitive issue. Why didn't it affect his reputation more? Well, I guess because Australia didn't have casualties is probably a fundamental reason. One person died, but not as a result of, not in Iraq as a result of battle. And therefore, I think the war never assumed the large presence in our politics that it did in, well, obviously in America and in Britain too.
So the families of the dead soldiers in both Britain and the United States have carried the feeling about the war, I suppose, to the... That's what you're saying?
Well, I think that is a quite central factor why it hasn't tarnished Howard more.
I want later, just in case people are interested, I want to talk about the asylum seeker issue, but later when we look at some policy areas that are difficult, and I'll come back to that because I think that obviously the Howard years is associated with that. But if we move from Howard to Paul Keating, who I think you'd agree was and is a very polarising figure, and in some ways, well, in some ways I find him the most interesting figure of all the prime ministers we've had certainly since Whitlam. I'm just interested in your assessment of what he did and didn't achieve, and perhaps if I can put it more like this, I think he was trying to really transform the culture with the Republic and with symbolic reconciliation with the Indigenous people and so on. I suppose my question is, why didn't he achieve more of cultural shift, do you think? Well, if you agree with that.
I think Keating will go down in history more for what he did as Treasurer than as Prime Minister. I mean, it's interesting that he came as Treasurer almost from a standing start, he was put into the job quite soon before they won government and felt he'd sort of been dumped in it a bit. and it was a huge learning curve for him, and he really was the driving force, although Hawke's role was also, I would argue, central in those reforms that we've been talking about. And if Hawke hadn't been supportive of his treasurer, and sometimes reined him in too, the whole story would have not been as good as it ended up. By the time...
So it's a team that was...
The team was important.
Yeah.
And I think it was Keating's sort of energy, drive, his relationship with Bill Kelty, who was ACTU secretary at the time, who was interested in reform, who wasn't just defending the union movement, but was seeing how the union movement could cooperate with the government to get change, often unpopular change, often change that really was going to benefit workers in the longer term, but, cost wages in the short term, and so you had the social wage notion. By the time he got to be Prime Minister, in a sense, he was a bit worn out, I think. He was not a robust figure, in a way, Keating. No, normally these leaders are strong as horses, it has to be said. But Keating was not quite like that, and so you had these stories of, he didn't start till 9:15 or 10 o'clock or whatever it was.
Having listened to Marla before he entered.
All that stuff. And I think he put a lot of energy into that unwinnable election which he won, the 93 election. And it was a sort of brilliant election campaign from his point of view. But then afterwards, some budget realities caught up with the government, and so you had the post-election budget, which was just a total disaster. It was just, we all remember 2014, but just go back and think about that first budget of the Keating government, which was brought down by John Dawkins, and there's a lot of similarities.
Yes.
Promises broken, unpopular measures, terrible trouble in the Senate, the whole catastrophe. So that started that whole Keating government on a sour note, or at least the post-election Keating government. And then he took up some issues, some of which frankly were quite strange, like he refought the Second World War.
Trying to take us down to Papua New Guinea rather than Gallipoli.
Yes, he was sort of contesting the British decisions and role and so on, and all that seemed a bit, odd and energy absorbing. And on the Republic, I guess he didn't have a lot of time on that, whether it had, and it went on a few years beyond that, but whether he could have managed it better, who knows. But it wasn't a sort of core issue, I don't think, for many people, or for a majority of people. And the Indigenous issue, his role was important, but that is such a long-term issue that there was a limited amount that
and we might talk about that later.
So, in a way, I think people also, even though they'd voted for him, had the memory of the recession we had to have. So he came to the job with baggage, and that was difficult for him. But I think he just never grasped the prime ministership in the way that he grasped the Treasury job. Yeah.
And if we now turn to in a way the strangest of all the Prime Ministers, Kevin Rudd. In my view, a really driven politician. I think a very intelligent, my sense of him is a very intelligent person, but the general view would be, and I'd be really interested to know whether you share it, that weakness of character undid him. Do you think, is that fair, do you think, or...?
Well, I'm struck by the way that Kevin Rudd came in with a big majority, big mandate, and blew it. And very few years later, Tony Abbott came in with a big majority and big mandate and blew that too. So it was really quite extraordinary. Now, Kevin Rudd was more popular than Tony Abbott, but nevertheless, the fact that both could have these big wins and then just set fire to the joint was really odd.
Yeah.
Odd. Now, why with Kevin Rudd? A lot does go back to character of these people and their ability to handle the job. Kevin Rudd, of course, was hit by the global financial crisis, and that was a pretty huge thing at the time, even though when it passed, everybody said, oh, well, of course we didn't go into recession and moved right on. So the government got very little thanks for keeping us out of recession, and partly that was also because you had the home insulation disasters, and you had an argument about whether too much was spent,
yes,
whether we could have got the same result for less money. But Kevin Rudd ran cabinet badly, was not able to manage his colleagues effectively, and I think that and had this manic work style. Which,
a little bit like Fraser in...
yes, that's true, actually, but worse, I think,
worse
than Fraser. Because he seemed within his own office and with his ministers just to be so demanding and likely to have tantrums and so on. Yes, I think you're right that there's a parallel, but it was a more intense
version.
Problem. And that just alienated people. And then, of course, he would invest a huge amount in things, and the Copenhagen Conference on Climate was one example of that, and he saw himself as sort of saving the world, and that fell apart, and then he went into a total slump.
A sort of a personal depression, kind of.
Well, not literally, I don't suppose, but yes, really not able to then say, well, that didn't work out, but we must refocus on other things, not able to move on. And then his colleagues just became very fearful that the polls were turning down and they'd lose an election. And I think they wouldn't have lost that election myself. I think he'd have done better than Gillard did. But panic set in, and that's the way of things these days, that polls have become so central to how politics is played that the reaction was very sharp.
Yeah. One of the things that I find strange as an outsider, and as a journalist I'd like you to comment on this, there wasn't much reporting of his unpopularity with his colleagues or that sort of dysfunctional nature of his government until pretty late in the piece. And so when the kind of coup within the party happened, I think it had a very destabilising effect on the Labor Party because the public kind of got a shock.
I think it was only picked up fairly late in the piece, because remember that earlier on the attention and the coverage was concentrated on things like the financial crisis and those substantive policy challenges. So people were hearing about it, but it was only in those last few months that really it built up and people started to be talking more about it and so on. And I think it was post-Copenhagen that the full picture started to emerge.
And if we could, there's limited time, so I have to move on to Julia Gillard. It seems to me there are two, let's say narratives we now call them, about her government. One narrative is that she was done in by reactionary and misogynist forces, and her global moment was her improvised misogyny speech. On the other hand, there's the narrative that says that she was incompetent, had a political tin ear, made very serious mistakes, the most famous being the carbon tax reference. Where do you stand? Maybe you agree with neither, but where do you stand in regard to why she didn't achieve more?
Well, I think her fundamental problem was the way she got there. And I think that a leader who is seen to stab another leader in the back, or having come there by stabbing them in the back, is always going to carry a burden, and we're seeing this with Malcolm Turnbull at the moment to some extent. So that is, I think, her fundamental problem. Actually, an exception to my point, I should say, is probably Bob Hawke, but about the stabbing in the back, but many leaders who get there by that means. So she came, there was a bit of hype, of course, first woman, popular figure. She'd always looked the new big thing when she was deputy, had a lot of support. But then she arrived and people, well, I put it that people had the feeling nice girls don't carry knives. And I think that really made things difficult for her. Now you can say that it was a good thing Rudd was removed, or you can have another view, but I think the reality is that really was a problem for her. Then, of course, in the campaign, you just got Rudd bastardry, basically, with the leaks and the undermining and that terrible joint press conference in Brisbane where they tried to say that they really liked each other and all that stuff. So out of all that came a bad election campaign, a bad result. She was a very good negotiator and she got the minority government set up, but that was always going to be difficult. She went into the alliance with the Greens, which probably seemed sensible at the time, but the Greens extracted their pound of flesh on the carbon issue, and therefore she'd been caught out with, I won't have a carbon tax, and now I've got a carbon tax. So it was a combination, I think, of issues, and once someone's down, then they get kicked for all sorts of other reasons. So sexism came in. It would have probably always been there, but it was able to be used more strongly because she had other
already
problems.
She was in trouble.
So I think, I don't think she was an incompetent manager, but I think that loaded down with these other difficulties, she wasn't able really to get on top of the job, and she had a very ruthless opposition. Not a terribly difficult Senate, because the Greens and Labor had a majority, but of course on certain issues the Greens kicked up and wouldn't support the government, but it wasn't as difficult a Senate, for example, as the one we saw last term. But it was just very hard for a new Prime Minister who'd sort of probably come to the job before she was totally ready for the job, to manage to cope with all that.
Yes. Now we come to what some people would regard as the worst government since William McMahon, Tony Abbott, maybe even worse in some ways. Things he did which seemed sort of semi-crazy, like reinstituting knighthoods and so on. But what's your explanation for the it seems like a very strange period. Or put it another way, you could say he's almost the most effective opposition leader since Whitlam, and then...
Yes, he was a very effective opposition.
And then the worst Prime Minister since William McMahon.
Well, it is hard to explain. I think that there was a lot of arrogance, really, that was a factor in the problems of that government. I think there was a great deal of tribalism, a feeling of them and us, and them, the rest of the world, was sort of defined as pretty broadly and us pretty narrowly. Again, I spoke before about the Keating government's budget, but that 2014 budget was really, I think, the defining period in that government, and that was a complete misjudgment of how much a government could do in one budget, ignoring or not understanding the whole fairness issue. Now, they did put in the high income levy and say this was to make things fair and the burden wasn't all on the lower incomes, but basically a totally unfair budget, completely badly judged. I think Hockey gave that speech ending the age of entitlement in Britain a couple of years before they came to power, a year or so, and at the time it was sort of said, oh, you know, that's Hockey and not really what the Libs were about, but it turned out that that was the ideological underpinning of that budget. And so that was just complete disaster. I think Tony Abbott's eccentricities in terms, as you say, of knighthoods and the Prince Philip thing, and I think he was just stunned that that would have such a reaction. And it was frankly surprising that it had quite the reaction it did, because it was a significant factor in that first assault on his leadership. I think that obviously the much talked about role of Peter Credlin, his chief of staff, who reinforced this sort of control, well, she ran a control regime, but reinforced the bunker mentality, was another disaster. He was always, there's no doubt he was always somewhat worried about Malcolm Turnbull, so, you know, they made sure that Turnbull was marginalised, which meant that when there was any sort of crack in the scene, Turnbull had the will to exploit that. But Turnbull couldn't have got there if it hadn't been, the Abbott regime hadn't been so bad. But there was always someone there for it with Turnbull in the wings. There was always an alternative if the worst came to the worst, which it obviously did. Yeah. So there was a combination of factors, but in a way, as with Rudd, it's hard, even when you put all those factors together, to quite explain how it all just blew up.
How it all blew up. I mean, it's a very striking fact, is it not, that before Turnbull, the last three Prime Ministers have all not managed to keep the confidence of their colleagues and have all lost office while still holding, you know, enough numbers in the House of Representatives to maintain government. Is this a trend, or is it an accident, a coincidence? And I suppose the real question is Malcolm Turnbull going to be the fourth? I mean, I know we can't answer that, but is this, the real question is it a trend, or is it just a series of accidents that have made it happen? I don't think
it's a series of accidents, but I think that rather than saying it's a trend, I would say that leaders, prime ministers, because opposition leaders have always been fairly vulnerable, but prime ministers are much more vulnerable, I think, than they might have been in the past. And I think that the fact you get this sort of constant monitoring by polls, it's as though, you know, the heartbeat is always being measured. Now, there have been polls, of course, for many, many, many decades, but now they're there every fortnight. And that does make parties more skittish. And the other thing is, I think that the 24-hour news cycle, again, adds to this vulnerability and adds to a sort of culture of complaint, so that the negatives are always there in front of us.
Would you, I mean, I know it's unfair, but would you predict that Malcolm Turnbull can last? I mean, I suppose the question with him is, you know, he's so obvious, I mean, even within the, you know, you've been writing about in the last few days, he's so vulnerable to the Cory Bernardis and to the Eric Abetzes and the pro-Abbott forces within his own party. And I wonder whether he can survive, given that there is a natural opposition already formed in such a short time.
I don't think I want to predict. It's too dangerous, too dangerous territory. But
Jared Henderson will remember.
But I would say that we see sort of this vulnerability emerging already with Turnbull. There's no doubt about this, and it's not just one thing. I mean, I don't think that Cory Bernardi, for example, is actually there trying to return the party to Tony Abbott. I think what Cory Bernardi is doing is saying a section of the party believes in these things, and I'm going to, with others, galvanise that section and pursue these ideological objectives. Now, there are other people probably that would be separately saying, oh, well, you know, is it possible Abbott could return? And I noted there was an article in the telly today, I think, canvassing, you know, whether this was possible. It's interesting that even after such short a time and with such a disaster for Abbott, that one would even, you know, think of writing about that. So that's another strand of this. And then you will have, as time goes on, you will have other people in a panic about the polls and about the electoral prospects. And so there are a number of sort of strands and tendencies here that are separate, although they're interrelated, and all of them make it extraordinarily difficult for Turnbull to do much at all.
I mean, I suppose it's another unfair question, but I wonder whether you think he's going to have or even engineer a showdown with the pro-Abbott forces, or whether he's going to try and keep them on side.
Well, I don't know that the pro-Abbott forces are that numerous. They're there, but I don't know at this stage that they are numerous. I think that the ideological forces on the right are quite strong around issues. But the trouble is that you can't really have a showdown with these groups very effectively. I mean, how does he have a showdown with those who are saying change 18C? He says, well, it's not my priority, I'm not doing it. They put up a private members bill. There's debate both in the parliamentary party, there's a debate among commentators, but there's no flashpoint. Yeah. Abbott makes speeches. What can Turnbull do about that? You know, Abbott's got the right to make a speech. He's a backbencher. He gets attention. Turnbull used to make speeches even as a minister, setting out certain differences with the then Prime Minister. So it is possible there could be a showdown, but I think it would have to come in the form of an issue that arose and Turnbull said, I'm going to do this my way. He can't just say, look, I don't like Cory Bernardi promoting these issues, because a backbencher has a right to do that. But some people have talked, and I'm not saying this is going to happen, but some people have said well, what about if the gay marriage plebiscite machinery doesn't get through the Senate? And Turnbull then said, well, we should accept that we'll have a conscience vote for the Liberal Party in Parliament, and I want to do it that way. Well, that would probably provoke a showdown of major proportions. I don't think he would do that because I think he, doesn't want to blow things up, and he's shown in previous occasions that, he gives in.
Yeah.
But it's always possible, because he's a very short-fused guy, it's always possible that it just, he got up one day and said, enough.
I've had it, yeah.
And I'm going to take a stand.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Michelle, there will be plenty of time for questions, but just perhaps raise 3 or 4 different kinds of issues, sort of policy or even cultural issues in the last 40 years or so, and I'd love to get your take on them. First one I'd like to raise is Malcolm Fraser always used to say that his greatest achievement was the support his government gave for multiculturalism, and so as part of that for Asian migration via the refugee intake. I just wonder whether you think governments have been very important in what I think most people would think is a very successful transition from white Australia to a multiracial, multicultural society that we now have. Have governments played a good role, do you think, in that?
Yes, I think basically they have, and I think you've got to see this perhaps in a wider context too, though, as a successful post-war immigration policy, because in the immediate post-war period we had a big influx of Europeans and refugees from Europe and so on, and that, in a way, that sort of paved the way for what came later. So I would see it as a continuum. But I think also what contributed to making all that easier was that we had good growth over many years.
Yes.
So when you've got a growing economy and there's sort of plenty for everyone, it does make it easier to promote a multicultural society. It just improves the mood all round, I think, and you have to take that into account as quite an important factor, as well as actual government policy in the area.
And I must say I was surprised that the One Nation Party made a return. There have been 2 periods of a sort of political challenge to, let's say, the multicultural nature of the society. One in 96 to 2001 with Pauline Hanson, and now again that was based more on Asian migration questions. This one is now, I think, based on the Muslim issue. Do you think we should take this seriously, or is it a sort of marginal? And how do we explain, I suppose the pressing issue now is the rebirth of One Nation, which most of us thought was over?
Well, I think it's not just on the Muslim issue. I think One Nation has come back in part because of a reaction to globalisation, a reaction to economic factors, just as I was saying that having good growth in earlier years made multiculturalism easier to promote and to have accepted. So people feeling more insecure economically, less well off in comparative terms to perhaps as they'd felt before, more worried about how economic change was going to hit them. I think that is a very big factor in the Hansonite support.
But I mean, one argument, one of the sort of slightly complicated argument, but in Britain, the Brexit vote is taken to be a similar sort of reaction against globalisation. And I think insofar as Trump has support, it's largely about amongst white male, but also just middle class, as they call them in America, Rust Belt areas or mining areas, which are doing it tough now. And in Australia, maybe what's interesting is how muted that's been.
It's been muted, but nevertheless it's there, I think.
Yes.
And one of the failures, when you look back on it, of the Turnbull campaign was to forget that for many people, this is not an age of excitement.
Yeah.
For many people, it's an age of insecurity, anxiety, a more casualised workforce. So if you're not working, you're not getting holiday pay or whatever, and you're not sure where the next position or contract or whatever is coming from.
Yes.
And so the transition in the economy, maybe for some people a very positive thing and going into new exciting IT jobs and so on. But for other people, it's, I don't know where the hell I'm going to go. I don't know where I'll be in 10 years. I don't know where my kids are going to get jobs. And so I think that was a factor in the Hanson vote. It was a factor in why Turnbull's message just didn't resonate with many people. In fact, it seemed absurd to some people.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. But I'm beginning to, I think Malcolm Turnbull is, like Rudd actually, a highly intelligent, articulate person. But I'm beginning to really doubt deeply his political judgment. Say, I think John Howard had to a fault even. There are just two questions about Turnbull. I'd like to get your opinion. Could he have believed that having a double dissolution and a new Senate was going to give him a less unruly Senate? Or another way of putting it, how could he have believed that?
Well, this is interesting because he talked about this the other day and he pointed out that of the crossbenchers, I think perhaps only one or two was going out. And he made the point that therefore, if you'd had a half Senate election, you'd have had most of the existing crossbenchers stay, plus you would have had, a few more potentially elected. That was his argument anyway. He said you'd end up roughly with the same number, perhaps even one more than at present. So, I don't know, many people would have said, well, the quota, they wouldn't have been able to make it. Hanson would have made it, but other people mightn't have been able to, and so on. But anyway, that's his rationale, which I thought was at least interesting.
I hadn't heard that.
Now, in terms of whether they will be more difficult or not, I think perhaps the jury is still out on that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised, for example, if on the industrial legislation they don't come to the party with some amendments, the ABCC and so on. On budget things, who knows? But they may end up being as difficult, but I think that he basically got sick of the last lot and it does seem to me that having got 4 Hanson people there, this has been a fairly irresponsible decision on his part. Not that, of course, he would have anticipated that. But in terms of the difficulty they present, I think the next few months will tell that.
I mean, what you said earlier about him miscalculating the idea that people are going to be excited by his idea of living in exciting times, and combine that with going to an election basically on a program of gradual corporate tax cuts, seemed to me almost insane as an electoral strategy.
Well, I think on the age of excitement and so on, I think that just reflects that he's sort of centred on himself and his experience.
Yeah.
And his experience over most of his life, despite the video and so on about his very early life, is that it's always been a success, well, not always politically successful, but I mean, it's always been a prosperous, exciting life. And he just doesn't have the life experience to relate very well to the former coal miner in some regional backblocks of Queensland. So I think that is his problem there. In terms of the election policy, well, coming off the budget, of course, was always going to mean that you had a very limited election platform, because he didn't really add anything to the budget. It was just the budget. Clearly they had this big flirtation, particularly Scott Morrison, with a big package of tax reform and the change with the GST and so on. And the numbers came in showing that wouldn't produce much growth. I myself have never got to the bottom of how Martin Parkinson, for example, who used to be head of Treasury, now head of PMs, used to give all these speeches saying we need massive tax reform, and yet when they crunched the numbers, it didn't seem that massive tax reform was going to do anything for anybody much. Yes. So I can't put the economist's view, sort of before and after the number crunching together. It's a mystery to me. But anyway, they abandoned the GST, and of course partly that was the backbench worrying about it, and partly the numbers. And then they came to the conclusion that the best economic stimulus was a company tax cut. But if you can't get that through the Senate, it's not going to do a lot, because the main economic benefit of that company tax cut actually comes from giving it to bigger companies, and that's at the end of the process, and that's also what's not going to get through the Senate.
Just two more questions and then we'll open it to the audience. One is, I've noticed in your writing actually that I think you feel quite deeply about the asylum seeker issue. You're generally very objective, but occasionally I've noticed a little bit of passion almost in the writing you've had on that. I just wondered, I suppose the question I have is Howard mainly responsible for the harshness of what Australia might be seen as having almost the harshest asylum seeker policy in the developed world? Or is there something else you think that might explain it?
Well, obviously the Howard government brought in the whole harsh policy, but by the time it left office, most of those people had been taken off the offshore places. I think it was easier in those days to get out of some of the harshness after a long time, because they could be brought to Australia and there was less publicity given to that and so on. I don't think it's only the Howard government. I think that fear of losing control of the borders goes back in part to Australia's historical attitudes to threats from the north, which have been there all through our history in various guises. And then to come back to the present, after the Howard government, of course, the Labor government misjudged, and its loosening of border controls meant that we had that surge of people coming in, and then there was a reaction against that. The opposition made much of it, was totally obstructionist when the Labor government tried the Malaysia solution, and Rudd, desperate to maximise the vote in the 2013 election, proposed an even harsher regime, and that was taken over by the present government, by the Abbott government, and continued by the Turnbull government. I think in terms of where we are now, that seems really a complete impasse about how you deal with the people on Nauru and Manus. I was talking to someone in government this week who had, I thought, been hopeful that post-election you could get something done, and seemed to be saying there's nothing that can be done. Now, I think that there have been efforts to get other governments to take these people, and basically we've run out of options unless something materialises. My own opinion is that the best solution now would be to, at the same time, get the people off, perhaps through a deal with New Zealand or something like that, and at the same time reinforce the border turnbacks. And I think that it seems to me that you could do this in a one-off way, and the danger of starting the people smuggling traffic would be pretty limited. We do have a whole navy. You wonder how we deal with a serious sea threat if we can't deal with a few boats. But I think you've got to do, but I think you'd have to do that strengthening at the same time as you did some one-off amnesty or deal with New Zealand or whatever.
I think, there's one more question I was going to ask, but I think I'll leave it in because I'm sure there's a lot of questions from the audience. There are microphones around, so if I could ask you to show hands, and we should have plenty of time for some questions. Someone help with the microphone?
Is that working? Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. We've been discussing the sort of Whitlam era through at a social level with my friends for quite a while now. And I think all the people I talk to think that our best leaders, the ones who led good teams, had a vision for where they saw Australia needing to be, that they could articulate and that the populace would support. Do you believe, Michelle, that we've run out of those sort of leaders that have visions for where Australia needs to be in a long-term sense?
I made the point before that both Whitlam and Hawke were, in a sense, helped by the times that they operated in, although Whitlam ran into bad times in another sense. I think one of the problems at the moment is that the way forward and what needs to be done is less clear than it was in those times. So Hawke knew that Australia had to open the economy, and Whitlam knew that a number of issues had to be addressed, like health, education, and so on. But now I think that there is just a general confusion about where the country goes, about how you get growth, adequate growth into the economy, about a number of social issues. So it is harder for governments, for leaders to crystallise, well, even to formulate what should be done and then crystallise a message, because it's just very confusing what should be done or how to do it. So I think that is a fundamental problem, and the fact that the population is more cynical and more disillusioned with politics than ever. Yes, it is. It is. But if you're operating against the background of an electorate that really thinks that politicians don't are not operating in good faith anymore, that are just in it for themselves. Now, of course, we've always had a strand in Australia that says that a disrespect for authority and some scepticism about politicians. But I think that this has, as it has abroad, just intensified, and all the research shows this. And so that makes it really hard for politicians leaders to make progress, get people's attention even, and get their backing for things. And also this age of insecurity that we've been talking about, again, exacerbates the problem. So maybe we just don't have as good leaders at the moment, but even if we had better leaders, I think the circumstances and the problems that they are grappling with are more difficult. Certainly the circumstances.
There's lots of hands.
Enjoying the talk this evening, thank you very much. My name's Wendy Miller. I'd just like your comments, Michelle, on Australia's efforts to remain sitting on the fence when it comes to the power struggle between China and America, the US, in the Asia-Pacific region.
Well, I think that this is obviously an immense foreign policy challenge, and we've probably only seen the beginning of this. It goes to judgments about how China will evolve over the next 2-3 decades, and I think that that's extremely difficult to predict. We obviously have an interest in maintaining the best possible relationship we can with China, and we also have very primary ties to the Americans. The issues for us, I guess, have been very much crystallised in terms of the relationship with China, with some of these investment decisions. And my own view is that the government's decision, for example, on the New South Wales electricity grid was a reasonable decision, and I think that the decision on the Darwin port was not a very sound decision. I think that we do have to think in the long term on those sorts of questions. In terms of the South China Sea, well, it seems to me that the policy that's being pursued at the moment is the Australian policy is a reasonable policy. But this whole situation, looking decades ahead, not looking next year, is one that's going to be a big challenge for our region.
Can I just say one thing before we take the next question? That the next Ideas in Society event will have Professor Hugh White, who has written a book called China Choice, which is very fundamentally he has a slightly dissenting view from the normal view about what Australian and American policy should be in the time of the rise of China. So I invite everyone to come along. It'll be late October, early November. So there are many hands.
Thank you for a most interesting talk. My name's Steve Waters. I'd like to get your comment on the concept of political credibility. And it stems from a senior Labor minister said to me once that once a political leader loses credibility, they can never get it back. He said that in the context of the carbon tax in the Gillard era of government. But now we have a Prime Minister who came to the leadership with the public view of certain views on politics. It seems that he was prepared to sacrifice those in a deal with the right wing of the party. Now, I'm not going to ask you to, as you said, you wouldn't speak about the longevity of the current Prime Minister. But is it possible for a political leader to win back credibility? And do you know of any examples where that's actually happened?
Well, I think it's difficult, and I think you're right that with a section of the population, the fact that Malcolm Turnbull made those compromises has dented his credibility. It's not the only reason he's got problems, I'd stress that, but it certainly didn't help him. The general point is that once you lose credibility, it's very hard to get back. I think he's right, and especially when politics moves as fast as it does today. However, you'd have to say that if you look back historically, John Howard, when he was opposition leader and overthrown, had no credibility in the end, and obviously came back and became leader again and became Prime Minister. If you go back even further, Robert Menzies had no credibility when he lost the Prime Ministership, but ended up rebuilding or building a new party and becoming the longest serving Prime Minister. So yes, it's possible to get credibility back, but it's a very hard slog, doesn't happen very often. Best to try not to lose it, I'd say. There's one down here.
Hi, my name's... It's on? It's on? Cool. Hi, my name's Shay Evans. I just want to... You talked before about tribalism of us and them in politics, and we talk about it a lot, I feel, in Australia, but what do you feel has been the most cooperative period in the last 40 years of both government and opposition working together?
Interesting question.
That's a very hard question. The Liberals like to say that they were really cooperative in the 80s when there were those economic reforms going through. I don't know that that actually would stand up to very close analysis. On a few things they were, on some things they weren't. But I suppose that perhaps is the most cooperative period, but it's really hard to identify closely, but I guess the 80s.
Can I add one possibility, not on the broadest sense, but one issue which I think is very important, which was during the Fraser period, first there were 2,000 boat arrivals in Darwin, but then the Fraser government made the decision to take roughly 10,000 refugees from Southeast Asia a year. And I think one of the great acts of politics was Mick Young in particular, and the opposition, particularly with Bill Hayden in that period, which didn't make any politics of it at all. And I think it's one of the reasons that things went so smoothly in what was really mass Asian migration and not of, dentists from Singapore.
Yes. Yes, and I guess you could say that there's been cooperation on specific issues.
Yes.
But identifying a period would be an interesting PhD thesis if anyone's looking for a topic.
So there are questions in the middle of the hall. We've been down the front a lot.
Hi, my name's Lily Falconer. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned earlier about our predilection for opinion polls and the effect of the 24-hour news cycle and how that made our parties slightly jittery and potentially we've lost leaders unnecessarily due to that. I was wondering whether you feel that that has permeated genuine policy and whether it's kind of cultivated an age of short-termism.
Yes, I do think it has permeated policy. I can't stress enough how much ministers are dominated in their thinking by media things, media attention and what will play in the media, what's likely to blow up in the media. And they therefore demand from the public servants that the advice is particularly sensitive on these sorts of issues, and also that that the public servants are aware of what's going on in the very, very short term. And I think that this does have a quite destructive effect on policy. It is really bad. I think, and it's hard for a journalist to say this, but I do think that ministers are out in the media excessively. I use the example of, I don't know whether any of you watch Sky on Friday afternoon, you're probably spared that. But if you do, there's Pine, Christopher Pine and Richard Marles have their own show. And the other day I saw them interviewing Samantha Maiden, a leading journalist who works for the Sunday News Limited papers, and I thought, when you stand back and think about this, this is bizarre, you know. Here is a cabinet minister who, even if he's much cleverer than all of us, presumably has a lot of work to get across. And here he is with this Labor front bencher interviewing a journalist on Friday afternoon. It is really quite startling. And I just wonder whether somebody is going to say, Christopher, can the show till the next election. But the obsession with the media, I think, has become much greater in recent years and is taking a lot of time, attention, energy, and somewhat distorting policy thinking, because everything has to be about how it will play in the short term rather than whether it'll really work in 5 years.
So we have time for a couple more questions if there are. There's one here and one up the back, and that will be it, I think. So there's a gentleman in.
My name is Jeff Thomas. It's been my impression that the media is far too, particularly the press, and possible exception of Tamberg, had been way too quiet on instances of political opportunism on the part of our parliamentarians, particularly. Thinking of Rudd when he wanted to move the Navy up to Brisbane from Sydney Harbour. Thinking of Abbott when he tried to stop the Malaysian solution. I'm thinking of Turnbull when he stepped in the CFA dispute here in Victoria. I don't think they got called out quite as much as they should for what the opportunism that they were showing. Just wondering what your impressions of that.
I tend to think that they do get a fair caning on issues. I think that there's a fair amount of criticism on a number of fronts, some of those that you mean, including some of those that you mentioned. I think it's also true, though, that because of a whole lot of factors that have gone on in the media in recent years, like the sort of general collapse of the business model, which has led to a shrinking of reporting resources and so on, that you don't get the sort of critical analysis of detailed policy areas, health policy, education policy, defence, whatever, that would be desirable. So I do think that they get a fair bit of criticism, but I don't think that the media is these days particularly equipped to spend the time on and have the specialists on much of the policy work that governments do. For example, a few years ago, you would have had in Canberra several health reporters, people who devoted a lot of their time to covering health policy, now hardly any.
There's the final question.
Thank you. Terrific debate. My name's David Fallick, and just following on from that question, Michelle, what is the future of democracy and the system we've grown up with in this country if, as we see the major media being slashed and burned, less and less space being given to serious comment and analysis? Digital can take over some of it, but perhaps not all of it. Is this not a fairly gloomy forecast for future governments and the ability to analyse and criticise their performance?
I really feel that we should have ended on an upbeat. You've been a terrific audience, and now I've got this question saying, isn't everything going to the proverbial? Well, you're probably right. I can't say that I see, some shining future for really good media, and it does make the democratic process more difficult. We do need a really robust and penetrating and diverse media to do that, and at the moment what we see in the media is this paradox of concentration in the major media, while you do get fragmentation through the internet and so on, which is a whole issue for another day. Democracy overall, I think there are many negatives facing our democracy. There's no doubt about that, and sometimes it's easy to despair of the debate. But nevertheless, we need to keep it in perspective that I think that we do have a strong democratic system, and we need to encourage the positives in that. It is important that people be engaged and be sceptical but not overly cynical about the process. I think that the fact that you've had this growth in disillusionment is a bad thing. It's an understandable thing, but politicians and the political process need to be viewed as big positives that we have in our society that many societies don't have. I think it's alarming what we've seen happening and is happening particularly in the United States with the way debate is going there, and it's important if it can not go in that sort of direction in this society, that there needs to be as much respect as you can get in the political debate, and in acceptance of pluralism, even when that pluralism brings to prominence views that one doesn't like or doesn't share, but it is part of the system. And so while there are a number of negative trends going, let's also concentrate on the positive and the advantages we have.
We did end on an up. Can I say, it's always great to read Michelle and to hear her for 4 or 5 minutes that she does every morning with Fran Kelly. It's even especially a pleasure to hear her over an hour and a half almost, and speaking not only of yesterday or the last week, but over 40 years, to see what a grounded understanding she has of things, and is really the sort of, it seems to me, what you're speaking about, the kind of the respect we need for politics is advanced by the kind of careful, well-balanced work you do every day and have been doing for so many years. So I'd like to thank you very sincerely. And I thank the audience as well for the excellent questions. Thank you. So that's it.
Thank you again for coming.
And keep coming.
And keep engaged.